Hello, everyone. This is the webinar Advancing Religious Freedom in Different Political Regimes. The webinar is organized by the blog Talk About Law and Religion, which is an official blog of Brigham Young University International Center for Law and Religion Studies. My name is Dmitry Vovk. I co-edit this blog. Today, we are going to discuss the topic of promotion of religious freedom for all using the genre of personal story. It's our privilege to have 5 speakers with outstanding expertise in advancing religious freedom globally, including places where this fundamental right was or is seriously abused and violated. Our plan is to have 5 short presentations, quick presentations, and then a Q&A session. Feel free to submit your questions to our chat, or during the Q&A session, you can just raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. We are recording this meeting and will post it on the blog soon. In a few days, we will also publish a series of blog posts dedicated to the same problematic with the same speakers or contributors. And if you would like to follow our new series and posts, please consider subscribing to our monthly newsletter or just follow International Center for Law and Religion Studies on Twitter or Facebook. That's all from me, and let me give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Brad Scharffs, who is the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dimitrio. We appreciate your organizing this webinar and blog conversation, and appreciate your co-editorship of the blog. I also want to express thanks to Jane Wise and Blythe Shoup, who are integral in helping with that. And also welcome Amy Andrus, who is a new associate director of our center starting today. It's her first day with us, and she will also be helping out with the blog as one of the projects that she is working on. Over the last 20 years, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies has participated in certificate training programs on religion and the rule of law in a variety of challenging contexts, including for more than 10 years in China, for nearly as long in Vietnam, as well as Indonesia, where we have focused on Sharia and human rights, Laos, Nigeria, and an upcoming program scheduled in Uzbekistan. We've also worked for the last 5 years or so in Myanmar, where we've held more than 5 training programs. As you can imagine, with the developments there, this has been very humbling. Our last program was held just last December, and just a couple months later, the military coup took place, and the challenges in Myanmar became even more acute. Our key partner in Myanmar has been the Institute for Global Engagement and Seng, who works there. And she is joining me to talk a little bit about our Myanmar program. Seng, let me turn the floor to you.
Myanmar for several years has been included on the United Nations Commission for International Religious Freedom annual reports blacklist as a country of particular concern. In 2012, an incident in Rakhine State occurred between Rakhine Buddhists and Muslims, escalating into nationwide religious conflicts between different faith groups. Then came the rise of the Buddhist nationalist group Mabata, also known as the Association for Protection of Race and Religion. This Mabata movement promoted fear of being invaded by foreign religions and influence, along with damaging relations between other religious groups. Social media played an important role in spreading false news and hate speech and further dividing people of different faiths. A reconciliating peace-building effort was introduced, the Religion and Rule of Law Training Program, to assist Myanmar in promoting religious freedom. In 2015, the Institute for Global Engagement, in partnership with the International Center for Law and Religion Studies of Brigham Young University Law School, were invited to give the Religion and the Rule of Law training in Yangon by local religious leaders, promoting them with resources, tools, and lessons learned from similar international cases. For the successful implementation of the Religion and Rule of Law training programs in specific regions, identifying key stakeholders was the first pressing matter. Listening to local concerns and needs was the most effective way to show caring, along with regular engagement showing consistent concern for local needs. Trust building is the key in organizing such training programs because of the nature of the topics, how the topics on religion and rule of law are perceived, and the risk of having conflicting opinions on those topics. Only when there's an understanding of the topic sensitivity will local partners feel comfortable with the partnership. Bringing potential local partners to similar programs conducted in neighboring countries so they can see that what their training programs are like will help them understand the value of such programs in their countries. The main objective of the training program is to connect people who would not otherwise be together because of religious differences. It is important because religion is considered a separate profession or a subject matter that is outside of other secular matters in Myanmar. It is unusual for religious leaders to sit down and talk with people from different backgrounds, such as scholars, activists, lawyers, politicians, legislators, and people from different faith traditions. In the course of training and discussions, including break time and lunchtime, they build up friendships and respect for each other. With such friendship and trust, they can explore ways to collaborate. The religion and rule of law trainings are designed to encourage local participants to take the initiative in solving their problems, while providing them with tools and resources they can use. The most unique thing about the curriculum of the religion and rule of law training is that it is developed at the request, input, and guidance of the local partners. Since the training is all about providing resources and tools for local participants, the curriculum development process focuses on serving local interests and needs. Only after agreeing on the topics of the lectures and countries, the organizers begin the invitation process for international faculty. Since connecting people is key to the training program, the organizers begin with casual meetings with previous participants and partners in Yangon and in Mandalay. Such meetings are the bridge to reconnect people who have lost touch with each other and to share updates and collaborations going on among alumni. It also continues relationship with international faculty, reminding the alumni that international faculty are willing to help provide resources and expertise for work in promoting religious freedom and religious peace building in Myanmar.
Thanks, Seng, for discussing that. Let me just mention one other thing we've done as a center. We've organized an advanced young scholars workshop on religion and the rule of law at Oxford University, held annually, which brings young professors from around the world to learn how to teach a comparative and international law class on law and religion, and to engage in intensive writing tutorials with legal writing professors who help participants publish English language scholarly articles. We'll be holding that again next year in July and August, and hope that some who are participating in this webinar might consider participating in that program at Oxford. Over the years, we've identified a set of principles or rules of thumb that guide our efforts in these international engagements. For the sake of brevity and clarity, we've tried to distill these into a basic guidelines, a baker's dozen of basic guidelines. I'll have to move quickly. First, always work in collaboration with high quality international and local partners and stakeholders. Having the right partners is the single most important ingredient of success. Second, our work lies at the intersection of law and religion. This enables us to address sensitive issues through the analytical lens of the law, which encourages pragmatic problem-solving approaches and often lowers the temperature and the volume of discourse. Three, we strive to bring to bear international law and comparative law perspectives. This fosters an atmosphere of mutual exchange and learning rather than a perception of instruction. Fourth, we approach the topic as a set of shared problems with a variety of approaches and solutions rather than a single solution. Five, bring together experts from a variety of backgrounds and legal systems, including those that are of particular interest to the host groups. We typically include experts from about 8 to 12 countries in each of our training programs. Six, include local experts and perspectives, rather than just relying upon foreign or outside perspectives. We generally reserve 30 to 50% of all teaching sessions for local participants. Seven, realize that as international and comparative law scholars, we have something important to share, but we are not the genuine experts on local issues and conditions. 8, provide plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. This is the best place to address local issues and challenges. Usually the local participants will bring these up and will be more receptive to outside perspectives if we are responding to their concerns rather than just offering criticism. Number 9, make sure to invest in high quality interpretation. The value of teaching is only as high as the quality of the translation. 10, PowerPoints and visuals can be quite helpful in these settings. Number 11, as Seng said, local partners and participants should be involved in selecting the topics to be covered in training programs. We usually provide a menu of possible topics and also ask for their suggestions. 12, we must have an instinct to listen carefully, and attitudes of humility are very important in these international training settings. Finally, number 13, ongoing sustained engagement is more likely to make a difference than a single large and dramatic gesture. Let me stop there.
Many thanks to Brett Scharffs and Seng Aung for their presentation, and we have started with a sort of educational element of promotion of religious freedom, and now we're probably moving to politics and diplomacy. Our second speaker is Jan Figel, who is a former European Union Special Envoy for promotion of freedom of religion or belief outside of the European Union. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dmitro. The floor is ours, and ours is also the responsibility to use not only this time, but our possibilities for making 21st century more humane time. And it means also to promote freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, to believe or to change or even not to believe, because it's the deepest expression of human dignity. And if we mean it, then we will use the time somehow for improvement, for different, better century. Advancing religious freedom in different political regimes is the topic, and immediate question connected with this is why it is important, this advancing. I think because it is the measure, principle, and instrument, as I said, of humanization and civilizational process. It makes a society and times more humane, more respectful, more just. It is important because religious freedom, or as we say here in Europe, freedom of religion or belief, is expression of human dignity of each person and each community, each society, nation. Primary role of each power is to provide peace to its people. And peace all the time is fruit of justice, if we don't mean armistice or appeasement, but real lasting peace. And justice today is centered around human rights for all. And as we all know, human dignity is a foundational principle of all human rights. We have rights and we have duties because we are endowed with dignity of personhood. Religious freedom is very central and expansive right. Its centrality is proven by location and content. It is represented by Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which contains 30 articles. So really it is in the middle, in the center. And secondly, and that's not incidental, it is expansive right and a very influential issue because it tackles rights implemented individually or collectively, in private or in public, by practice, worship, teaching, observance. Religious freedom is a freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, as I said, and there is nothing more deeply or more deep as expression of one's personal freedom. If this is not respected by regime, by political regime, or by public authorities, then other rights are disrespected, disregarded as well. And especially we know and we see disrespect of freedom of opinion, freedom of expression today, media, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and not only because of COVID. Therefore, we can say freedom of regional belief is a litmus test of all human rights. So it's not more, it's not about other rights, but it's very critical for just and respectful, tolerant society. It reveals actually character of a political regime. By its definition, religious freedom is crucial for believers and non-believers, for citizens holding faith or none. FORB is important for people from A to Z, as we like to see, for atheists, from atheists to Zoroastrians. Second point of the theme is advancement. Why advancing of religious freedom is important? Because worldwide situation is worrying and worsening even. So this is double negativity. Pew Research Institute in Washington, Pew Research Center, speaks very clearly and repeatedly about very reliable and professional surveys. Close to 80% of population live in countries with high or very high obstacles to religious freedom. And these numbers, unfortunately, regretfully, are growing. So we can say only a minority of the global population enjoy religious freedom as a guaranteed civil right. And when we speak about the regimes, we of course mean all systems, secular and or religious or anti-religious, which exist in today's world. Majority is secular, but still we have these problems. We mean not only authoritarian and totalitarian countries, which of course is the most striking case or cases, but also democratic countries, because many times our democracies tend to be simply majoritarian as a rule. But democracy without values is a rule of majority or rule of tyranny, as we know from history. So be vigilant and be active. And levels of problem with different political regimes is, I would say, quadruple, which means very, very painful reality, because it's about intolerance, discrimination, but also persecution and genocides. This is not theory. This is not, enumeration or a list from the history. It's reality in today's world, 21st century, including genocides. The most shocking abuse of human rights in our times. This is a message from Jeremy Hunt, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and an FCO leader in London on persecution. This was a special report, Ruro's report, with this clause. And that's reality. I don't want to mention other reports. There are many and regular and quite reliable, and of course, most of them shocking for those who don't follow very closely situation in today's world in religious freedom. There are different forms of advancement. It's usually defense and advocacy, very important for concrete cases, for concrete lives. This is again not theory, but reality. And then promotion and protection of FORB in international relations as policy, with a lot of practical connections or issues. Probably the best known for you in the United States is IRF Act from 1998 with commission and special policy within State Department, ambassador. Then Magnitsky Act, European Union adopted in 2013 special guidelines for protection and promotion of FORB. Since 2016, there was the first ever Special Envoy. Now there is a repetition or continuity finally. And it is followed by many countries, which was never the case before. Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Hungary, United Kingdom, Poland, Czech Republic, Lithuania, Estonia. They established their special envoys, ambassadors, diplomats dealing with this agenda. And I like to mention that now we have ministerial summits since Washington 2018 and especially 19 with a lot of interest, coverage, commitments. It was then followed in Poland 2020 and Brazil follows this year. We have a new alliance, which is not military alliance or security, but it's International Religious Freedom and Belief Alliance established in February 2020 in Washington. Again, very important new phenomenon, commitment of more than 30 countries to do more, to be together on this important quest for civilizational and humanitarian improvements. It's about the exchange of information, but also joint diplomatic actions. There are different working groups. I want to still mention some good news, which means like International Parliamentarians Platform existing and working since 2014 globally as a parliamentary wing to this governmental advancement. But also, which is also case now with this webinar, very active civil society, which means NGOs like in IRF roundtables starting from Washington, academic centers like European Academy of Religion or ICLRS Provo, the host of this webinar, Institute for Global Engagement, Religious Freedom Institute, G20 Interfaith Forum, etc., etc. Fortunately, we have now a plethora of actions and actors, and that's good. It's not the end of story. It's a new phenomenon. We see also a lot of movement on religious level with religious social responsibility. Products like Amman Declaration, Beirut Declaration of Faith for Rights, Marrakesh, Abu Dhabi Declaration on Human Fraternity. These are not only papers. These are really signals, messages, commitments. People don't read too much documents, encyclicals or fatwas, but they see images. They see different leaders together speaking unisono or in brotherly spirit. That's great for a better century. So we see, and I conclude here, an emerging global religious freedom movement. And I hope it will deliver a lot of good fruits. COVID 2019 or 2019 as a new situation globally came with COVID, made the situation even more critical, even more urgent. And I also would like at the end to praise especially Declaration on Human Dignity for All, or better to say for everyone, everywhere, which promotes importance of culture of dignity, because this ethical principle leads to something which is highly political and legal, and it is equal or dignified citizenship. And in political terms, we then can see if we respect this root, this principle, pluralism. Pluralism, whether constitutional or covenantal. And with this in mind, I want to conclude and to wish all, not only speakers, but especially participants, a lot of inspiration and encouragement for action. Our times need courage, needs also education and active citizenship. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Figel, for your speech and for finding time to join us, and I look forward to your participation in the discussion, and specifically for your last sentence about courage and good citizenship, I would say. Our next speaker is Mina Yildirim. Mina is the head of the Freedom of Belief Initiative and head of the Eurasia Civil Society Program at Norwegian Helsinki Group. And Mina is also a member of the OEC ODHR expert panel on freedom of religion or belief. Mina, the floor is ours, but the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Many thanks to the organizers for this interesting webinar and also for inviting me. To give you a context for my reflections, I would like to talk a little bit about the Freedom of Belief initiative, which I'm heading. The initiative is a human rights project that aims to contribute to the protection of freedom of religion or belief for all in Turkey. So it's a country-specific project. And the activities of the project center on systematic monitoring and reporting. We publish annual reports and also thematic reports and make concrete policy recommendations to the government of Turkey and other actors. So advocacy is one of the core activities of the project, and therefore international human rights compliance control mechanisms are very important here. So we provide submissions in the context of the Universal Periodic Review and the UN treaty body mechanisms, and also the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers. This is a priority area for us because for Turkey has important international human rights commitments, and these mechanisms provide an important venue for engagement. We also focus on creating a platform for constructive discussion on complex freedom of religion or belief issues through conferences or roundtables, and now more so through online events, including webinars. Finally, in the recent years, we also work on capacity building. The Freedom of Belief Initiative is a project of the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, which is a human rights organization based in Oslo. And now it has a center on freedom of religion or belief. And together with the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, the center has 2 projects at the moment. The Freedom of Belief Initiative, working together with Norwegian Helsinki Committee, provides an interesting model, I think, a human rights organization. But if you ask people in Turkey who know Freedom of Belief Initiative, they will think it's a local project. They will not think it's a Norwegian project. So it's an international project, but also quite local. It is quite interesting that I'm speaking now about the project because it's its 10th anniversary. So it has been 10 years since the project has been established. And it was during my doctoral studies at Åbo Academy Institute for Human Rights, where my thesis focused on the collective dimension of freedom of religion or belief in international human rights law. And I also did a case study on Turkey. As I was doing my field work, I was struck by how fragmented the approach to freedom of religion or belief protection was in Turkey. In terms of frame of reference, state engagement vis-a-vis religion or belief communities, and also human rights organizations. Human rights organizations in Turkey did not report on religious freedom or made this a priority issue, although this issue is critical for democratization in the country. And so starting Freedom of Belief initiative was a response to this situation. So it has been an effort to fill this gap, to advocate for freedom of religion or belief for all, and also to utilize the international human rights law framework. Which also allows for strong civil society engagement. So I'm drawing my reflections mostly from my work within Turkey, but also I had the opportunity to work in some Central Asian countries, and more recently in relation to Western Balkans for an IPP4 study, which will be published soon, a roadmap for parliamentarians to advance freedom of religion or belief in Western countries. I can say that while each country is unique, and each country, whenever you speak to public authorities, they will say their country is unique and it should be an exception in some ways. There are often common challenges, such as deeply rooted contextual ways of approaching freedom of religion or belief issues, the place of religion in the country and how religious differences are viewed, majority-minority dynamics and historical hostilities and state-religion relationships play a very important roles. I will focus on the human rights-based approach and also engagement with different actors. So human rights-based approach to advocating for freedom of religion or belief provides the opportunity and tools to engage, to changing the paradigm through which FORB issues have been addressed historically. In this sense, such an approach may trigger some resistance, but also it provides openings for new collaborations and guidance on resolving long-standing issues. I find that another important benefit of the human rights-based approach is that the treaties that form the frame of reference provide a compliance control mechanism, which also involves ways for civil society engagement. So important features of these mechanisms are that they are quite egalitarian. So you don't have to be part of an alliance or a special group to be able to make a contribution to treaty bodies or international compliance control mechanisms. Civil society organizations can make submissions. And these are connected to domestic processes. So for example, the European UPR involves, and also UN treaty body mechanisms involve national consultations. So these types of mechanisms are much more linked to national processes. And therefore, if prioritizing the effectiveness of these kinds of intergovernmental mechanisms would benefit, I think, promotion of freedom of religion or belief locally. In my experience, this way of engagement that also our initiative has prioritized helped draw new groups of people to religious freedom work and helped trigger response from public authorities. And I can give you two concrete examples that come to mind through our submissions to the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers on the Seng group of cases and the Ülke group of cases. The first one dealing with the Alevi community, religious freedom issues, and the second one with conscientious objection to military service. Through submissions, the Turkish authorities, the Committee of Ministers was able to reach far-reaching decisions, calling Turkish authorities to take specific actions in relation to the enforcement of these judgments. And such an approach is also conducive to connect the freedom of religion or belief work to wider human rights framework. In the case of our initiative, we focus on connection to the rights to education, rights to association, and more recently to gender equality. And this is the right thing to do since all human rights are indivisible and interdependent, but it also has the added advantage of widening our network and collaboration with organizations or actors working in connection to these rights. And secondly, second theme I would like to reflect on is engagement with public authorities and other actors. As the speakers so far have already pointed out, it takes time to earn trust. So for meaningful engagement with any actor, long-term engagement is essential. And the space of freedom of religion or belief is a complex one. There are often important vulnerabilities, strong boundaries, and each community or actor has specific sensitivities or red lines. So to navigate within this space, it is, I think, essential to have a principled approach and a transparent methodology. And this builds credibility in time. With regard to public authorities, they are most open when there is an active reform process, and research shows this. And also, I think I think most of us would attest to that, that when there is a reform process, then public authorities are most open to civil society engagement and guidance or information sharing and recommendations. With regard to religion or belief communities, establishing a relationship based on openness, respect, professionalism, and genuine engagement contributes to collaborative work. It's important to see that many religion or belief communities have been working on advocating for their rights for a very long time, and they have so much experience already and have made significant sacrifices, and they feel they bear the responsibility for the well-being of their communities. So it's important to be mindful of that and not to harm. That's the first rule, of course. It is also important to recognize that religion or belief communities are very diverse. If our methodology allows for the participation of diverse groups, then the resulting work will also reflect this. And clearly the space of freedom of religion or belief work is very much male-oriented, dominated. And interestingly, having this method where we, for example, in our work, always invites, not focus necessarily on leadership of religion or belief communities, but invites wide-ranging actors. We find that women are quite interested in participating. And in our work, we have found that we have more women participants than men. And we have not analyzed the reasons for this, but we are quite happy that it is so. I think I have used my time, so I will stop here and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mina. I assume we are crossing the border from Turkey to Iraq, and our next speaker is Knox Thames. Knox is a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement and visiting expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Knox, please, you're welcome.
Thank you. You never know how one action can change the world. Unappreciated work can have reverberations far beyond what one imagines. So to make this point before I share about my specific efforts in Iraq, I want to start with an example from computer technology. For just about everyone, your handheld device is a daily reality, if not an addiction. We use apps to read the news, watch sports, watch movies, play games, and more. The first killer app came out way back in 1979. It was a program called Visicalc, and it was the first electronic spreadsheet. Now, it came about when a student at Harvard Business School back in 1977, a guy named Dan Brinklin, was watching his professor create a financial model on a blackboard using chalk. And he would painstakingly write out the formulas and data, putting them into different cells on the blackboard. And then when he wanted to change something or he found an error, he'd have to erase one cell, which would cause this cascading effect of having to fix many other cells. It took forever. And so Blinken realized that he could replicate this process on a computer using an electronic spreadsheet. And this would get the results instantaneously when data was changed, but he would have to use computers. Now, no one put much value into this at the time because computers were expensive and owned by just a few corporations, and they filled up rooms. Yet Brinklin and a friend toiled away in their garage for 2 years with this idea. Now, I start my presentation with this seeming non sequitur because we're discussing today opportunities and success stories for focusing on freedom of religion or belief globally. And you just never know how one small action can change the world, that can have unintended consequences that are just unforeseen years later. So back to the country at hand, Iraq. Since the 2003 invasion by the United States and the ISIS onslaught in 2014, the future for religious minorities has grown increasingly dire in that country. Iraq once held the largest Christian community in the Middle East that was estimated at about 1.5 million. And it has dwindled to maybe 200,000, 250,000, just a shadow of its former self. Many people have referred to Iraq as the cradle for Christianity, now fear it's going to become a graveyard. And other faith communities have also suffered. We all saw in horror the treatment of the Yazidis by ISIS back in 2015. When I served in the Trump and Obama State Departments in a special envoy role, I made many visits to Iraq to try to hear firsthand about the challenges facing minorities. I wanted to know what needs to happen to ensure that these ancient communities can remain. What can the United States, what can the international community do to restore the unique religious tapestry of Iraq with its multitude of different faiths? So in these diplomatic engagements, I would search for ways to try to turn the tide against these seemingly unstoppable currents that were driving minorities out. They were caught between extremists on one side and discriminatory laws and policies that creates this witch's brew of vexing challenges with no easy or immediate solutions. But I'm proud to say we were able to make some progress working with Iraqis of different backgrounds in the government and outside of government and the international community. And the two key issues we tried to confront were security and restoring places of worship. First, on security, from my multiple visits, everybody was focused on security. How can we ask people to go back to their homes that had been occupied by ISIS if they were literally afraid of being beheaded in the night? So in that belt, the minority belt in Iraq that kind of circles north of Mosul in northern Iraq, you have Christians living in the Nineveh province and Yazidis in Sinjar and other communities sprinkled through both. They're now awash with militias and rival gangs, and this creates push-pull factors. Minorities are pushed out for fear of extremist violence or militia extortions, and they're pulled out by friends and family that have escaped to the West and are telling them about a better life. So across two administrations, I and others would consistently raise the importance of minorities playing an active role in their own protection, because if they can't, they're going to leave. The other issue we confronted was cultural heritage. Now, while the world witnessed ISIS committing a genocide against Yazidis and Christians, they also attempted a cultural genocide, destroying places of worship and cultural sites that were meaningful to both communities, as well as the majority Muslim population. And we saw how the loss of these cultural places of cultural meaning really inhibited returns. It was a missing piece of the puzzle when trying to reconstruct the country. So over both administrations, we worked hard to equip religious minorities in Iraq with the tools they need to preserve and protect their unique cultural heritage. We created a partnership with the Smithsonian Institution. We sent them out to northern Iraq twice to conduct trainings to really do hands-on first aid for cultural heritage with religious minorities. It was an engagement that never had been done before, and we were able to bridge the divide between cultural heritage professionals and religious leaders. And the United States government and others also put funding in, as has UNESCO, and a very cool project that's being funded by the United Arab Emirates to restore the major mosque and minaret in Mosul, but also two historic churches. Now, an initial indicator that we were making some progress was when the Pope visited back in March. The fact that he was able to make this journey, traveling to southern Iraq, central Iraq, and northern Iraq safely with no incidents, shows that maybe the security environment for minorities is starting to improve. And he was able to experience Iraq's cultural heritage, going to the place where tradition holds that Abraham came from. He visited Church Square in Mosul, where Abu al-Baghdadi proclaimed the caliphate and said he was going to march on Rome. Yet now, because of the security environment, ISIS has been defeated, and these churches are being restored by the international community. So it was a very powerful moment. And so the challenges facing Iraqi Christians and religious minorities are going to take years to fully address. It's not over. We've got a long way to go. But the news is not all bad. These efforts have made some progress to start to change the environment where the future might be a little bit brighter than it was a few years before. Now, to go back to my initial story about Visicalc, to wrap up my presentation. So when Brinklin, the student, was in his garage working away, he had to figure out how to deliver this new app. And so he approached a small company called Apple, run by a guy who was working out of his garage named Steve Jobs, who had just developed a new interface called Windows. And so once released on the Apple II, this app became the must-have device for business school graduates, accountants, and others who push numbers for a living. And now they had a reason to buy a computer. And it transformed the industry and created a reason to have a personal computer. And so Visicalc sold over 700,000 copies in 6 years. And Steve Jobs later credited it with being really the key factor that made personal computing a success. Another observer quipped that the Apple II was sold as a Visicalc accessory. People would buy the $2,000 computer for the $100 app. And so I wrap up by this lesson is an important example of perseverance. Had Brinklin not stayed committed, had he listened to the naysayers, his company would have never seen success. But there's also another element to the story. There was also the unforeseen consequence that his app created basically the personal computing industry. No Visicalc, no Apple II, no Macintosh, no iPhone, no MacBook, no Pixar, no Toy Story, and all these great movies. So there were all these unforeseen positive reverberations because this young man stayed true to his vision, out of sight, despite people saying it wouldn't work. And I think for those of us working today to end religious persecution, those of us who are fighting for freedom of religion or belief in tough places like Burma that we've heard about, or Turkey that we just heard about, or places around the world, we've got to stay committed to this vision that we know can exist, that humanity will be better off when everybody everywhere is free to pursue truth as their conscience leads. I mean, Apple became Apple because two students in a garage made a small contribution to produce this app before anyone knew what an app was. And so in the same way, all of us in the fight for religious freedom need to stay committed to keep pushing along, keep making our contributions, knowing that eventually, if we all put our shoulder to the wheel, that we can see a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Knox, for this impressive story. Our final presentation by an Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, Elizabeth Clark. Elizabeth, will we go back to Europe?
Sounds good. Well, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this and to hear from people I admire so much. Knox and Jan and Mina and Brett, and it's really a pleasure to be on the same panel with you. I admire the work that you do. My work has mostly been as an academic. I work with and have consulted with national governments, NGOs, the US government, other international organizations, and worked on particularly law reform projects. I work with Brett, and he discussed quite in depth the training programs that we do as a center. But another key factor that we've been involved in over the years has been law reform, whether it's amicus briefs or analyses of draft laws, trying to bring some technical legal expertise to these questions. And so my work has been focused on assessing and promoting compliance with international norms on freedom of religion and belief. I think it's important to stress, as other people have, that even when I'm working with the United States government, the approach has never been to impose American values on the world, but rather to look to international norms. I also like to step back for a second. I think sometimes there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And so I'm going to give two quick theories. The first one is 3 approaches about how we can influence human rights compliance. This is primarily from an international perspective, but the truth is, as we've seen and heard today, that these issues invariably create partnerships between local and international actors and aren't successful otherwise. And then I'll talk about a model that's been proposed about how regimes change. So in terms of trying to influence countries, there's the rational choice model, which is sort of economics-based, this idea that material inducements will encourage change. That's certainly the theory of the International Religious Freedom Act in the United States and this country of particular concern model that it creates. And I've seen that happen with countries in Vietnam and Uzbekistan, where they're sort of on the margin of being listed as a country of particular concern, and the impetus that can give a country to try and make some changes. Other approaches also include sort of a more constructivist model, it's more political science-based, that focuses on repeated interactions, argumentation, exposure to norms. I think we've all heard from that today as well. Certainly that's where a lot of my work has been, in this kind of repeated interactions with government officials, building trust, trying to engage in specific discussions about what international norms mean in a given context, and looking at specifically at provisions in law, and bringing in experts from around the world to bring best practices. And the third, which is more sociological, psychological, is a acculturation model. The idea that there's cognitive and social pressures to conform in order to belong to an in-group. Sort of the theory in the EU was that once the other countries had joined it after the fall of communism, the theory is that being part of this in-group and wanting to be part and being part of that would promote change. So that's one set of models. Here's my other one, and then I'll get back to some of the more interesting, I hope, sort of stories and approaches. But there's Visicalc and Seng had this spiral model of how regimes move from repression to more rule-consistent behavior. And so he looks at, look at domestic and international players in how they influence this process of socialization and changes of norms within a country. And they list 5 steps, moving from a position of repression to denial, where the repression may actually get worse, but at least the government feels that it has to account for it. And so they accept the awareness that their reputation is involved. Then to tactical concessions, and then to the point where the prescriptive status of human rights norms are accepted, and finally to more rule-consistent behavior. And unfortunately, as we've seen, countries don't only move in one direction. This isn't that simple. I mean, certainly that's the situation in Myanmar right now, and governments can certainly get stuck at different points. But I think thinking about this model is useful because it helps highlight where international and domestic players can contribute to promoting what we've heard, the significance of a system of rule of law, of justice, of human rights, and freedom of religion or belief for everyone, everywhere. In the early stages of repression, models of naming and shaming can be useful, or sanctions, and international actors can boomerang back or leverage the influence of small minority groups in the country. And then as we move to the tactical concession stage, and then to the acceptance of prescriptive frameworks for human rights norms, we see a lot more quiet behind the scenes work, this model of quiet diplomacy, expert advice, repeat engagement, building trust. Visicalc and Seng, who came up with the model, said, in other words, a process which began for instrumental reasons, with arguments being used merely rhetorically, increasingly becomes a true dialogue over human rights, specific human rights allegations in the target state. And it's my privilege to see some of that, and countries that initially are simply trying to get other countries off their back or reduce the bad publicity from their own country. As the discussions happen and these cultural norms become adopted, the discussion turns to specifics. And it's also important to realize how international politics will overlap with domestic politics. The thinker Robert Putnam described this in terms of 2-level games, right? What makes sense at one chessboard with one set of players may or may not make sense with that same person in the international chessboard with the different set of players, and shifts in one can trigger the other. It's crucial to recognize that countries are on their own trajectory domestically, so it gives some realistic sense of what the international community can and maybe can't do. I think we can be part of changes, but individual actors alone can't make changes. This is something that requires people domestically, people internationally, lawyers, policymakers, diplomats, a whole variety. And I think as we recognize the cultural, political, legal challenges that our partners are navigating, then we realize the significance of other types of benefits. I'm a lawyer. Our center tends to focus on questions of law and religion. But we see the value of those who, for example, provide religious literacy programs or bring religious leaders on board and the powerful influence that can have. Because law can certainly drive culture, but more often culture can drive or at least limit the effectiveness of law. And so I think this is also influences our expectations and timeline, that we don't expect change instantly. And we work with government leaders and policymakers as they are able in their situation. There's one Eastern European country I've been working with that's drafted new laws on religion periodically over the past 10 or 15 years. And there's got to have been at least half a dozen of these draft laws that I've gone through and given point by point commentary on. And none of them have actually passed. But it's interesting to see over time, though, how the laws have become more nuanced, how there's been more careful attention to international norms. In areas where there's pushback, it's more pushback specific on specific issues. And so this gives me hope. I know that there's a lot of realistic limits on what can be done by any set of individual people, but I certainly agree with Knox that one doesn't know what can make the difference in the end. I've seen, though, that international experts can be a resource, people who can be long-term players when governments come and go, who can raise issues with specificity, comparative knowledge, and build trust over time with domestic policymakers. And certainly that's the hope of our center, and I'm grateful to have been able to be here with all of you and to be able to discuss these issues. So I'll give the floor back to you, Dimitro.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Let me open the Q&A session. As I said, you may send your questions to our chat, and I see some questions submitted already. But just to start the discussion, the first question for me, to all our panelists. In your experience, what approaches, ideas, tools do not really work in advancing religious freedom globally? While in theory, they may look like a great solution or great approach. What don't work at all in your view? Any comments from anyone from our panelists? Jan?
I would start with saying that if there is visible discrepancy or difference between words and deeds, this is quite frequent in international relations, that there are many preachers or traditional talkers about importance of values or freedoms or rights, but then they breach their own words or international commitments. Secondly, I think that people generally, but especially entities like states, they don't like to be preached or directed, instructed. They don't like recommendations or policies to be imposed. And I think that, especially from EU point of view, the best method is, instead of imposing, proposing and sharing. And this works, not absolutely, but it's much more promising or realistic in achieving results. I've seen difference, and especially I like this approach of sharing or in cooperative mood, spirit, because, for example, on human dignity line, when you speak with different nations, different cultures on dignity, they have maybe different concepts, but there is something. And when you use just international talk on human rights, or try to impose it without benefits or as unilateralism, it didn't work. And when you do it in participatory and cooperative mood, it works. It worked in Sudan. It works even in Pakistan or Southeast Asia. And I think this is the road to take, with patience, of course, with perseverance, with credibility, of course, some stakes or input at stake. And then we must see, and when we see that it's about real stories, real cases, real fates, then it's even more human. So basically, this is my experience and also recommendation.
Intro, could I add something?
Yes,
yeah,
please.
I think one thing that doesn't work is getting your facts wrong. I've seen groups be a little loose with their information, not finding out exactly what was happening on the ground. And so when it would come to policymakers like myself, it would break the trust, they would lose credibility, and ultimately the people who were suffering wouldn't be helped. Also, what doesn't work is calling everything persecution. I think we have to be very careful in our terminology and reserve that word for the most heinous of violent actions against believers. And then lastly, what doesn't work long-term is a narrow focus only on just one community. Now, I think it's right for groups to go advocate for their own. We want to see that. That's a natural thing. That's a good thing. But we need to be building an environment where everybody has freedom of religion or belief, freedom of conscience, because it's in that environment where everyone can enjoy it, then the particular community that people are concerned about will have the brightest and most durable future. So, and I think this is where the religious freedom movement globally has expanded in a great way, that we talk about for all, religious freedom for all, while we're specific in our advocacy. But then seeing groups advocate for other communities, I think is a beautiful thing. And that's really going to get us to where we need to be.
Thanks. Any other comments from other panelists?
I raised my hand, but
Mina, yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. I agree with what has been already said. So I'll just add to that, I think. If there is no local ownership of the international promotion agenda, then it's very unlikely that it would be successful. But I should also say that each context can be different, and it's hard to make generalizations. So I'm saying what I'm saying with some caution, because it might really work in a specific country. I don't know, but this is kind of my general view, I would say. And the second one is if the international promotion prioritizes or focuses on tolerance, for example, only tolerance, rather than the human rights law framework, that would also not be successful, I think, in terms of improving freedom of religion or belief for all. And if we are speaking about international promotion of freedom of religion or belief, then this is, if it's not coming from intergovernmental organizations, then it could be very much linked to international politics or foreign policy priorities of specific countries or alliance of countries. So I think if international promotion is guided by domestic policy priorities, this would also not it would not resonate, I think, with the local actors, public authorities, certainly not, but also mostly for most of the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, we have a comment from our participant Rolando Madella. I'm quoting, interesting mention of Mina Yildirim about male dominance in most religions, and thus seems to be, my perception, part of the problem in many parts of the world. I think it's an even broader question about, from one side, engagement of women to interface dialogue to all these issues, and from other side, respect to religious autonomy. Mina and all other panelists, would you like to comment on this?
I can take a stab at it.
Maybe Elizabeth, go ahead.
Oh, either way. No, I think it's a good point. I think that many religious traditions have male leadership, and especially socially conservative ones in different parts of the world. And as you mentioned, Mitro, that there's an importance of autonomy and allowing groups to select their own leadership. But I think part of this means we need to think more broadly about who we're engaging with. Are we only formally engaging with the leader of a denomination, or are we bringing in other people from that denomination who have influence, whether or not they're a formal leader? I think that that's an important part of trying to make sure that we speak to men and women in a religious community, because whether or not women have a formal leadership position, they'll certainly have influence. And it would be a shame to lose that because we're so focused on talking to just the formal religious leaders.
Thank you. Mina, please.
Yes, absolutely. I think also once we have the women also sitting around the table, then we are also more able to see how their right to freedom of religion or belief is impacted through restrictions. So which maybe the male participants in a given roundtable may not be aware. I think we are thinking a bit more and more about the gender dimension of freedom of religion or belief. And as generally speaking, I think the religious freedom movement is in the process of learning and really seeking what this means. So it's very important to have the voices of those who are impacted and their ideas.
Thank you. Any other comments with respect to this gender dimension? Okay, yes, Jan, please.
Only small remark on this webinar, because we had 6 people speaking with moderator together, of course, but out of 6, we have 3 women and 3 men. So this approach, this webinar is a good case and even inspirational for many others to follow.
I would say that it's not occasionally that we have 3 men and 3 women. Many of you emphasize that in order to promote religious freedom, we need to work with local stakeholders, including central and local authorities in a certain country. But sometimes these authorities could be involved in violations of human rights and specifically religious freedom. And this is a sort of dilemma. You need those people in order to perceive some goals, in order to advance religious freedom. And at the same time, you can't work with them because of these circumstances, because of these reasons. In your view, what are principles of dealing with local politicians, local officials in such situations? Jan?
I would say there is one principle ethics, which is probably the oldest, ancient, which I try to use, and usually it somehow helps to open minds and doors or hearts and start some changes or a process leading to a change. It's a combination of silver and golden rules. When I speak to local, whatever, authorities or representatives, whether they are societal or religious or political, these principles mean don't do the others what you don't want the others to do unto you. And in a positive sense, do to others what you want the others to do unto you. These are ancient rules, so-called reciprocal ethics, and it's a base of dignity recognized and respected. And I must say, it works. It works with patience, it works with perseverance, it works with credibility of words and deeds. And of course, also what was mentioned before, we cannot segregate, isolate, select some and forget the others. When this approach shows sincerity and universality to all, dignity for all, and religious freedom for all, then it's difficult to object, difficult to oppose. And there are some seeds and some, follow-ups and followers of such approach. So I would say this method works because it's deeply human.
Thank you. Knox, please.
I would, add also to think about the approach differs on where you're sitting. Groups like Institute for Global Engagement, where I have an affiliation now, it's all about relationships. It's about finding the good people and bad governments, giving the knowledge and equipment. That's what's been so great about ICLARS and just equipping officials with information they need. When I was working at the State Department, at the same time, while we supported that approach, we also would use the Magnitsky Act to sanction officials who were perpetrators of extreme religious freedom violations. And I think it was that good cop, bad cop that would create the political will that was often lacking in environments like Vietnam or like Uzbekistan to give the people who wanted to do the right thing, the boost they needed, because there would be a consequence for inaction or continued violations. So I think it's you need to have a consequence, but you also need to extend a hand. And sometimes one organization can't do both. So that's why it takes many organizations working together towards a common goal. And I will have to apologize now. I've got to leave for a doctor's appointment, so I'll be signing off, but really appreciate the opportunity to speak and participating with so many good friends today.
Thank you, Knox. Stay healthy. Brett, please.
So I just want to echo what Knox is saying. I think that, it's not, I don't think of it so much as what works and what doesn't work, as much as thinking about what can I do that could possibly make a difference. And I think it varies significantly. If you're representing the US government, it's going to be different than if you're representing the Institute for Global Engagement. And it's going to be different if you're an academic working at an academic center like the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. One thing that is very important to us is to work within our field of expertise and to work in our lane. We talk a lot about, our lane, and our lane is law and religion. And what we find is we can do a lot of good working within that lane, but that doesn't mean that we don't recognize there are other important lanes as well. And so what legislators can do, what parliamentarians can do, what diplomats and foreign service officers can do, what hard power, what police and a military can do. We think the same principles apply. We think that the principles of human dignity for everyone everywhere are meaningful for power politics, for thinking about how the military should conduct itself, for thinking about how the police should behave, for thinking about how we ought to be monitoring our officials who run prisons or are working in border immigration facilities. Those basic principles of human dignity for everyone apply, but they're going to apply in different ways in different institutional contexts. So what we think is that by identifying the principles and then applying them in the various different settings, that creates an avenue for the prospect for progress. It doesn't work magic, but it at least helps us focus in the right direction.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Well, maybe I can add something that also ties in the question that Eileen Barker put in the Q&A in the chat.
Yes, please.
About how people don't necessarily want you to do or have or be what you would want, and isn't it best to find out what they want instead of assuming? And I think that's key. I think, and that ties in with what this first question was about people who, local government officials in some cases, who may be resistant to supporting religious freedom for everyone everywhere, or specifics in their own region. That although there's a role for different types of actors to play different things, some that do naming and shaming, and governments that can use more hard power and soft power. I think ultimately, for change to come with those officials or those individuals, is going to come from coming to know them, coming to find out what they want, what their concerns are. I mean, I think it's a process, and it's not going to happen in one meeting, and it's not going to happen without lots of time to talk outside of a formal structure. But trying to understand what the concerns are locally, and I believe that principles of freedom of belief will be a blessing to people in any regime. But I think it's crucial to listen to people in that regime and see what their concerns are, so that we can see how do those match up. Working with many Central Asian officials, for example, who are very concerned about security, and understandably so, right? Trying to find ways to help bring questions of freedom of religion and belief to the fore in terms of security, of promoting security and having a more stable government. That's more effective than trying to sort of say, no, you're wrong, you have to do it our way, you need freedom of religion and belief instead of security. But that kind of long-term process of coming to know local leaders and local needs, and work with them where they are and what their interests are.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Before Mina will add her comment, just to reiterate Ellen Barker's question. Sometimes people don't necessarily want to be what you would want. Is it best to find out what they might want rather than assume they want the same as you? Mina, jump in, please.
As a general rule of thumb, I think it's important to pay attention to what the local groups want, but this may, of course, also be diverse. So, for example, one particular religious group may not want particular action, but others may want to see that kind of action. I think that is why it's really important, whatever the organization is. For example, I'm thinking at the moment of an NGO that works on promoting freedom of religion or belief. And as Brett Scharffs has said, it differs what your role is, of course. But when I think about civil society organizations promoting freedom of religion or belief, I think it's important that they have worked out their approach and methodology, so they can take in what these diverse groups say they want, but then they still have to make a decision. And it may not be exactly what a particular group wants. That's why it's important to have principles established already from the onset, and also have a well thought out methodology, so this kind of decisions are easier to make. I also wanted to add, when, of course, as I mentioned, it's best when the country is going through a reform process, then public authorities want to input and want to collaborate. But when it is really a time where all the doors seem closed in the capital, then I find also, again, the international human rights compliance control mechanisms create a venue for dialogue. As NGOs get involved in those processes, then maybe the public authorities have to respond to that particular compliance control mechanisms. And as a result, the civil society hears sometimes the response of the public authorities. There can be such disconnection, and it can be only achieved through intergovernmental organizations. I have to say, at the moment, we are going through a process like that in Turkey. So we are finding out about certain working groups or working plans, action plans, through discussion or through these channels that exist at international mechanisms. Just one last addition: when public authorities seem very opposed to any collaboration, I think it's also a good time to invest in civil society and other actors. So there's always something to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments by panelists? Yes, Brett, please.
So Seng can probably address this better than I can, but I think you also have to be flexible. I think this is related to what Mina is saying. In Myanmar, for example, we've done some programs that are rather large and rather inclusive. And so we try to get many different religious groups involved, many different voices from those religious groups involved. And that works pretty well. But we've also done work in Myanmar with particular groups of people, sometimes persecuted minority groups. And sometimes they need to be able to have a conversation without everyone else present. And what they need is someone they can trust, who they can talk to and get some perspective, some ideas, some tools that might help them in the difficult situation in which they find themselves. And so I guess what I'm saying is it might be varied, what types of groups you work with and how inclusive it is. Seng, what would you say about that?
Yes, what I've learned over the years is that we work with a majority in our country, religious and ethnic majority. We have them included in our programs. So those majority will, they have never heard about other people's struggles and persecution because they live in a different world mostly. So when they're mixed with other minority groups and their struggle, and when they hear about those, they start to learn about their struggle, and then they empathize with them, and they feel the need to, when they become friends, they feel the need to promote religious freedom for their friends and not for other religion or anything. Also, another approach that we see is like majorities are the ones, if their mind is changed, that is when the big change is coming. And also, when we talk to the government, we always try to include their interests. If they're interested in the economic growth, we would bring in data and research on how religious freedom has contributed to the economic development in different countries. So that way they would not just fear of the word like religious freedom or human rights, but they also have something that they're interested in, something like economic growth of the country. But it's still very difficult to help a lot of international community to understand we need to work with the people in the persecuted group, because in order to promote religious freedom or religious peace building, we need to bring in the people and educate them that this is bad, and that impacts to other people in a way that's more diplomatic, but not in a way that's blaming them that they are the cause of it, but helping them understand if their perspective is changed, that will bring a lot of positive changes for the minorities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have one more question from Orlando Madela. I'm quoting, one concern is when a predominant religion in certain regimes affects the law and creates otherness leading to violation of all kinds of rights. What can the international community do now to alleviate the situation with these regimes? Any comments? Elizabeth, please.
Sure. I think that the situation that you're describing, Orlando, is one that moves us back towards the repression end of this spiral progression that countries can move along in terms of human rights compliance. And as you get more sort of overtly or legally repressive legal regimes, that then it becomes more effective to have different types of engagement, the name and blame or sanctions, or sort of focus the international compliance regime on those countries, on those actions, is most effective when the problems become deeply entrenched and repressive. If this is in a country that is less deeply entrenched, then there's more room for behind the scenes engagement, trying to encourage those who enforce the law to come up with moderating approaches or regulations that are less harsh. And so things can be done. Obviously, the ideal time is before the regime has changed the law and creating these kinds of marginalization by other groups.
Thank you. Any other comments? We have Mina, please.
Just very briefly, I think depending on the international, again, the compliance control mechanisms can be triggered to ask the public authorities questions about these legal changes and their impact on freedom of religion or belief. So they're, again, if they are part of the Council of Europe protection scheme or the United Nations, depending on which international human rights law treaties they have ratified, those can also become effective.
Thank you. We have one more question from one of our attendees, and I think it's a good question for not only good, but important question to be asked during this webinar. I'm quoting, the perspective of advocating for religious freedom seem like coming from the Western or American perspective. Some groups in the third world countries have a negative perspective about it just because it is coming from the American Western perspective. How do we localize it or make the advocacy become more acceptable for everyone without being deemed as another influence from the West or America? I mean, some of you have already touched this problem, but I think it makes sense to talk about this a bit deeper. Any comments from our panelists? Mina, please.
I think there are a number of things that can be done, but not in the short terms as much, but over a longer term. And that is really literacy about human rights. I think many people think that the human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the ICCPR, is a Western product, but maybe they don't know so much about the drafting history and how many experts from the different continents and different countries were involved. So I think whenever I am asked such a question, I always, for example, refer to Arkot Krishnaswamy, if I pronounce his name correctly, but there was so much input from India, for example, which has such rich diversity. So I think producing counter narrative is important. And also the other thing is when we have to remind people who think this way that many people from these non-Western countries are actually wanting to utilize these rights. So I think this brings us to the universality of human rights, because when we look at the people whose rights have been violated and who maybe seek legal remedies to correct their situation, these are people from non-Western countries. So it doesn't make this a Western notion, because it is owned by people from all around the world. Yeah, I think counter narrative, establishing the counter narrative is very important here, but it is a lot of work over a long period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. I see Jan is back, and I know that he's lack of time. So Jan, please.
Yeah, I will have to apologize from further participation, but this question is very important, very interesting. And again, I would like to stress the importance of credibility, which means words and deeds, sharing instead of imposing, a universality of some human principles, especially human dignity. And when maybe 30 years ago, I wouldn't be so optimistic, but I see a lot of fruits of martyrdom and conflicts or problems, especially in Oriental societies, because, for example, abuse of religion by ISIS, by jihadists or fundamentalists is a wake-up call for very specific and constructive messages like Aman declaration, or a common word from us to you about Abrahamic roots or Abrahamic community, Abrahamic religions, importance of fraternity, brotherhood, which is important not only in French language or post-revolutionary culture, but also today in the world and regions full of bloodshed and conflicts. Look to Middle East, what's going on there. On one side, conflict, but on the other, unprecedented recognition of relations and mutuality or respect between Arab countries and some Arab countries and Israel. So there is a hope, but this hope must be a fruit of real universal human values. And when we say, for example, biblical human dignity is image or imago Dei, I listened with a lot of interest and encouragement about Quranic roots of karamah or dignity, because if the Western and Eastern world or Christian and Muslim cultures, nations, agree on certain universal principles, then we have majority of global population on, let's say, one side of question or issue or importance, which I spoke at the beginning as the deepest expression of human personal freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. mind and heart. And then freedom to believe or not to believe or to change, which is not so obvious. And our contribution should be, of course, academic and political, but also very, very practical, because it is about freedom of religion. It's not about promotion of certain structures and organizations or religions, but freedom to believe or not to believe, to change, which is very important aspect of the whole debate, And the last point, which I shortly mentioned, we today speak about the responsibility of major giants, companies like Microsoft or Facebook or Twitter or Google, and corporate social responsibility. And of course it's important, but there is also religious social responsibility of those millions claiming their faith to something and different, that they cannot only claim their rights or expectations, but also their contribution, their responsibility for the status of society, for the status of the world, how we live, how we relate, what is the future. And I think that this is now much more visible and even vocal in international relations. And that's a very promising sign, in spite or as a fruit of martyrdom, in spite of conflicts.
Thank you very much. Any other comments, Elizabeth?
But thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
I
Jan.
have to leave, sorry.
I think it first needs to be acknowledged that, yes, there are some groups that are just trying to promote an American Western perspective or to promote religious freedom for their group and not others. But I think listening to people like Jan or Knox or Minna, you see that people who are effective in this field are ones who have a deep commitment to the dignity and freedom of religion or belief of everyone. And so I think a lot of what needs to happen is just to be careful with ourselves and how we implement things. You know, certainly as our center, we try to do every project we do with local partners, with people on the ground who have a depth of experience and knowledge of the community better than we do. People like Seng, who are just really the ones that that matter most, and the rest of us can just provide some bit of a megaphone or some bit of space or some bit of a technical expertise. I think in our work, we also make a point of trying to bring in experts from around the world, from different religious traditions and cultural traditions, so that it's clear that what is being discussed isn't just an American or a Western point of view, that human rights are an issue and a concern for people of all faiths and no faith everywhere. And I think it takes some humility to be able to see that and to pay attention in one's own work to make sure that we're not falling into just working on our own cultural paradigms.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Any other comments? Seng, please.
Yes, one thing that one of our partners, Buddhist group, what they did, they're from Norwegian human rights organization, and one is a Buddhist group in Norway. What they did is like they partner with the Buddhist group in Myanmar, and then they try to bridge the teaching of Buddhist teaching with human rights, and then they use the terms that will be acceptable in the local context. That was the one that I found very insightful.
Thank you so much. Any other comments? Professor Scharffs, would you like to comment?
So this issue of, I'll try to be brief, this issue of that this is a Western set of values that are being imposed is a common refrain. I was teaching a class in Indonesia a couple years ago, and a student, in a quite strident and angry way, said to me, "Aren't human rights just Western values that powerful countries are imposing upon less powerful countries?" And I was a little taken aback, but I asked her whether she thought Indonesia had a legitimate concern about the treatment of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And she said, of course, it's atrocious what's happening. It's close to a genocide. We have to be outraged about that. And I said, well, that's a powerful country, Indonesia, expressing a view about a less powerful country, Myanmar. And it was one of those rare moments of teaching where you actually sense that maybe something has happened, because she softened and she said, "You're right. We have to care about each other in order for us to claim that these values are universal." And so what I sometimes think we have to do is differentiate between the key word in the question, which is advocating. I think there are ways of advocating that are distinctly Western and can sometimes create an allergic reaction. But that doesn't undermine the universality of those values, especially those basic fundamental values of human dignity. I've never talked to people who don't care about their own freedoms, their freedoms to speak, to think, to worship, to choose or not worship. These are human values that really are universal, even though our modes of advocacy can take on cultural characteristics. And sometimes we have to be careful about that.
Okay, thank you so much for your comments. I think we can stop here. I'd like to say thank you to our panelists for their presentations, for their insightful comments, very provocative thoughts they shared with us, and for their expertise in advancing religious freedom all over the world. We see many cases, many examples, many successful stories and failures, and I think we all know much, learned a lot from this. Also, thank you so much to participants for your questions, for your attention, because I assume for some American states it's too early, and for some European countries it's too late for participating in some professional things. And my special thanks to ICLRS team, to Blythe and Amy for their efforts to organize and to promote this webinar. Thank you so much, and I hope there will be other activities of the blog Talk About Law and Religion.
The International Center for Law and Religion Studies is committed to helping secure the blessings of freedom of religion and belief for all people. Learn more about the center or find out how to get involved on our website at iclrs.org.